Welcome, and first of all, thank you for continuously tuning in and supporting the Captain Podcast. We're glad to have you with us for today's episode. I'm the Captain, your host, and today we're joined by an experienced airline pilot with a deep focus on flight safety. On this episode, we'll be discussing stabilized approaches, why they're essential for safe landings, and how pilots can consistently achieve them. We'll explore the importance of maintaining a stable approach, the key factors that define a stabilized approach, and tips for identifying and correcting deviations before they become issues. Stick with us as we explore this critical aspect of flight operations. All right, let's unpack this for our listeners. Many of them know the basics, but when we talk about a stabilized approach, what are the absolute non-negotiables? What truly defines it in the cockpit?
Right. Well, for us, a stabilized approach isn't just a vague idea. It means the aircraft is precisely on the correct flight path, only needing tiny minor adjustments.
Okay.
And crucially, it's about being at the proper speed in the correct configuration.
Yeah.
And this all needs to happen by a very specific point before landing. Specific altitude, right?
Exactly. The industry standard, across ICAO, FAA, EASA, pretty much every major airline globally, it's consistent. By 1,000 feet above the airport, that's AGL, above ground level, the aircraft must be fully stabilized.
Fully stabilized. And what does that actually encompass? What are those key parameters we're looking for at 1,000 feet?
Yeah, it's very specific because precision here is just everything. First, you have to be on the correct glide path and the runway centerline, both.
Glide path and centerline. Got it.
Second, the aircraft has to be in its final landing configuration. So landing gear down, landing flaps fully set, ready to land.
Makes sense.
Third, speed. This is critical. You need to be at your target approach speed, V approach. There's little tolerance, maybe up to 20 knots faster, but never slower than V approach.
Okay, so on speed or slightly fast, but never slow.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Fourth, your descent rate. It needs to be steady. Usually the limit is around 1,000 feet per minute. Brief deviations might happen, but you shouldn't be sustaining more than that down low.
And finally, the thrust setting. It needs to be appropriate for that configuration and descent rate, usually above idle, so the engines are spooled up, ready to respond.
Okay, so quite a few things need to line up.
They do. And here's the absolute kicker. If any one of those parameters isn't met by that 1,000-foot gate, a go-around is mandated. It's not optional.
Wow, any single one.
Any single one. And what's really striking is how universal these criteria are. You go anywhere in the world, any major carrier, the definition is basically the same. It just highlights how fundamental this concept is.
So when we boil it all down, what does this strict definition really mean for safety? Why should someone, whether they fly planes or just fly in them, care so much about this?
Oh, it's direct. It's profound, really. Stabilized approaches directly translate to safer landings, period.
Safer landings. How so?
Well, think about it. An aircraft delivered right onto the glide path at the correct speed, already configured. It gives the crew the absolute best possible chance for a smooth touchdown right in the touchdown zone. Not too far down the runway, not too short.
Reduces the variables at the last second.
Exactly. And it massively reduces pilot workload during the most critical phase of flight. Landing is busy. If the approach is stable, you have more mental bandwidth left over.
To do what?
To monitor. A monitor for unexpected traffic, sudden wind shifts, anything that might pop up last minute. It also ensures the aircraft's energy state is managed correctly.
Energy state. You mean speed and altitude.
Yeah, essentially. Not too high and fast, which risks overrunning the runway. And not too low and slow, which puts you closer to a potential stall or needing excessive power changes. It's about being in that just right energy window.
So a good landing really starts way back on the approach.
Absolutely. A good landing begins with a stable approach. Industry analysis says it time and time again. A stable approach is, and I quote loosely here, a major contributory factor in the safe conclusion of any flight. And critically, many accidents are frequently preceded by a poorly executed and consequently unstabilized approach, often combined with failing to go around. It's that stark.
Okay, that's crystal clear on the why it's important, but let's flip the coin.
Yeah.
Given how critical this is, what happens when it doesn't come together? What are the real sobering consequences when an approach isn't stable and maybe the crew decides to press on anyway?
Yeah, the consequences are, well, sobering is the right word. The statistics paint a very stark picture. There was a landmark study by the Flight Safety Foundation looking at accidents between 84 and 97. They found unstabilized approaches were a factor in something like 66%, two-thirds of the approach and landing accidents they studied.
66%. That's huge.
It is. And more recent IATA data from the 2010s showed unstable approaches contributed to somewhere between 14 and 16% of all accidents. So it's not some minor issue. It's a persistent, significant threat.
And what kinds of events are we talking about?
We're talking about the really bad stuff. Controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, runway overruns where you go off the end or side of the runway, hard landings, sometimes damaging the aircraft, even tail strikes.
Can you walk us through how an unstable approach leads to those specific outcomes? The how.
Sure. Let's take two scenarios. If you're low and slow, low energy state, we call it.
Right.
You're eroding your safety margins. You're closer to the stall speed, closer to terrain. A lot of CFIT accidents start this way, especially in poor visibility. And if you need to make a sudden maneuver, you might not have the performance. There's a real risk of stalling or loss of control.
Okay, that's low and slow. What about the other side?
High and fast, high energy. This is a big contributor to runway excursions. You simply have too much speed or altitude crossing the threshold, and you run out of runway trying to stop.
Makes sense.
Or to avoid the overrun, the pilot might try to force the aircraft down onto the runway, a kind of dive and flare maneuver. That can lead to excessive sink rates just before touchdown. Result, a really hard landing.
So both ends of the spectrum are dangerous.
Exactly. And these aren't just theoretical. There are real-world examples. A charter Learjet on a visual circling approach. They got unstable on the turn to final. Instead of going around, they tried to salvage it. They tightened the turn, got too slow, banked too much, stalled and crashed short.
Tragic.
Another one, a twin turboprop in clouds in IMC. Their descent rate got way too high, well over the 1,000 feet per minute limit, clearly unstable by their own rules.
But they kept going.
They kept going, never went around, flew right into trees and terrain before the runway. Both cases, the root cause was continuing an approach that was clearly unstable. The lesson is just brutal. Never try to save an unstable approach.
It seems so obvious when you lay it out like that. Which brings up the really baffling part. If the risks are so clear, why do we still see pilots continuing these unstable approaches? What do the stats tell us about that moment of decision?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's a huge focus in human factors research. The statistics here are genuinely alarming.
Go on.
Studies have shown that only about 3% of unstable approaches are actually broken off with a go-around.
Wait, only 3%, so 97% of the time
Yep.
they continue.
97% of the time, pilots continue an unstable approach towards a landing. It's basically a bad bet because the data screams that it's not okay.
That's chilling.
It is. One analysis found that over 80%, something like 83% of runway excursion accidents could have been avoided if the crew had just initiated a timely go-around.
83%.
So let's connect the dots. Nearly 2/3 of approach accidents involve an unstable approach. And in almost all those cases, the crew didn't go around when the signs were there. A stable approach isn't just best practice. It's essentially your last line of defense against, well, hitting the ground wrong.
That 97% figure is just staggering. So if the stakes are that high, how do professional crews consistently achieve these stable approaches? What are the techniques, the best practices they use day in, day out?
Right, it's not luck. It's about process and discipline. And it really starts way before that 1,000-foot gate. The key principle is energy management, right from the top of descent.
Top of descent. So way back.
Way back. A stabilized approach is the result of managing altitude and speed correctly all the way down. There's a classic rule of thumb, the 3.1 rule.
3.1.
Yeah. For every 3 nautical miles you have to go, you should plan to lose about 1,000 feet of altitude. That roughly mimics a standard 3-degree glide path. Pilots use this constantly for planning and monitoring their descent.
So if you're way off that profile.
If you're, say, 20 miles out and still have 10,000 feet to lose, you know you're high. You're going to be fast unless you do something now.
Like what?
Request vectors from ATC for more track miles. Use speed brakes or spoilers to increase drag. Or, if needed, request a holding pattern to lose altitude safely before continuing the approach. You have to be proactive.
Okay, so energy management from the start. What else?
Early configuration is huge. Experienced crews don't wait until 1,000 feet to get the gear and flaps down. Many airline procedures call for being fully configured for landing gear down, landing flaps set by maybe 1,500 feet AGL.
Getting it done earlier?
Exactly. It avoids scrambling at the last minute. By the time you hit 1,000 feet, the checklist should be done, the aircraft should be trimmed out, flying nicely and landing setup. All you should need are minor tweaks to power and pitch. Remember, 1,000 feet isn't the target to start configuring. It's the absolute deadline to be configured and stable.
That makes a lot of sense. What about technology?
Yeah.
Modern cockpits have so much automation. How does that play into achieving stability?
Automation. It's a double-edged sword sometimes. Used correctly, it's fantastic.
That is also.
Things like VNAV, managed descent modes, they can keep the aircraft precisely on the vertical path. An autopilot coupled to an ILS or LNAV VNAV approach can fly an incredibly stable profile, often more smoothly than a human pilot could. This frees up mental capacity.
Wait, there's a but, right?
There's always a but with automation. The key is vigilance. Pilots must actively monitor what the automation is doing. Is it capturing the glide path correctly? Is the speed managed properly? You have to be ready to intervene instantly if it's not performing as expected.
So ready to click it off and take manual control.
Absolutely. Be prepared to take over and fly the aircraft manually to get back on profile. And even with automation, basic tools like the visual approach slope indicators, PPI, or VSI lights beside the runway are crucial for a quick visual cross-check. Use the tech, but don't become complacent. Stay engaged. And, underpinning all of this is solid planning and briefing. A good approach brief isn't just reading chart details. It's explicitly discussing the plan for a stable approach.
What does that involve?
Talking about the target speed, the expected winds, the glide path angle, any potential challenges, and critically explicitly stating the commitment. If we're not stable by 1,000 feet, we go around.
Setting the expectation.
Exactly. And good crew resource management, CRM, means both pilots actively monitor and verbalize deviations. Speed creeping up, slightly above glide, adding a touch of power. Constant communication keeps everyone in the loop and helps catch deviations early.
That brings up teamwork and pressure. How do things like ATC instructions or maybe feeling rushed affect this? It must be tempting sometimes to just accept a tight vector or quick descent.
It absolutely is tempting. And that's where strong CRM and assertiveness are vital. The culture has to be one where the pilot monitoring feels completely empowered, completely comfortable saying, unstable, go around, regardless of rank.
And the company culture needs to support that.
Critically, good companies actively encourage go-arounds for safety. They don't punish crews for it. They recognize it as good airmanship. Pilots need to internalize that a go-around is a normal, safe maneuver, not a failure. And if ATC gives you a clearance that clearly jeopardizes stability, like a steep slam-dunk approach,
Right, I've heard that term.
it is absolutely okay. In fact, it's necessary to say unoble. Prioritize a safe, stable approach over expediency. Ask for a wider turn. Ask for holding if you need it. You are responsible for the safe operation of that aircraft. Don't let external pressure dictate unsafe actions. And just a couple more practical tips. Control your descent rate early. If you're consistently needing more than 1,000 feet per minute down low, that's a huge red flag for instability. Be extra careful on visual approaches, especially long runways. It's easy to let speed build up. Treat visuals with the same discipline as instrument approaches. And finally, use the standard callouts deliberately. Stable or unstable, go around. Make them clear action triggers.
Okay, so we have the techniques, the procedures, the tech. But we still come back to that statistic. 97% don't go around when unstable. Even with all this knowledge, something is happening in the cockpit. What are those human factors that make pilots hesitate?
This is where it gets really deep into psychology and operational reality. Several key factors consistently pop up in safety studies. One of the biggest is probably get-there-itis.
Get-there-itis.
Yeah, that strong psychological pull, especially after a long flight, to just get the airplane on the ground, complete the mission. Going around feels counterintuitive, like conceding defeat or failing.
And if you've saved one before.
Exactly. That's the insidious part. If you successfully land off a slightly unstable approach, it can reinforce the behavior. You think, see, I handled it. It normalizes the risk, makes you think you can do it again, but you're just rolling the dice hoping the conditions are favorable this time. Then there's the reluctance to admit a mistake, or maybe just imperfection, or appearing inept.
Ego.
Ego plays a part, sure, or just embarrassment. Especially if there's a steep authority gradient in the cockpit, a junior first officer might hesitate to call unstable on a senior captain's approach.
Yeah.
But true professionalism means having the humility to say, this isn't right, let's go around. The best flight departments actively foster this culture where safety trumps ego, always. Some even celebrate go-arounds as proof of good judgment.
That's a much healthier way to look at it.
Yeah.
What else stops that call?
Sometimes it's just the surprise factor or maybe a lack of recent practice with that specific scenario. We practice go-arounds in the sim, but often they're planned textbook events.
Right.
A real-world go-around might be needed suddenly at a low altitude, like 400 feet, maybe during a bounce recovery, or with flaps not fully set. These can feel more complex, more daunting than the standard sim profile if you haven't specifically practiced them.
So the hesitation comes from unfamiliarity in that critical moment.
It can, yes. The irony is, not going around in those messy situations is almost always far more dangerous. But that moment of hesitation, that feeling of, can I manage this go-around right now, can be just enough to make someone push ahead unwisely. And finally, we can't ignore the real external pressures. Fuel is a big one. If I go around, will I have enough fuel for another approach or to diverge?
Sure.
Passenger convenience, schedule pressure, maybe perceived management disapproval of delays or extra fuel burn. These pressures are real. Pilots feel them.
But they shouldn't dictate the decision.
They should never override safety. An accident is infinitely worse for schedules, costs, and everything else than a go-around or a diversion. Good operators have fuel policies that expect occasional go-arounds. The mantra has to be safety first, always. Better to go around, tanker some fuel if needed, or divert than to force a bad approach.
It really is a potent mix of psychology and pressure. So how do we overcome these powerful ingrained tendencies? How do we make that safe choice the default choice every time?
It comes back to mindset, reinforced constantly through training and culture, hammering home the message, a go-around is not failure, it's good airmanship. It's a successful outcome when the conditions aren't right for landing.
Reframing it.
Exactly. Reminding ourselves and each other that the go-around decision is often the last clear chance to prevent an accident. Think back to that 83% statistic for runway excursions avoidable by a go-around. That's powerful. The rule is simple. If the approach becomes unstabilized, an immediate go-around is required. Full stop. Never ever try to save it.
Okay, let's bust a couple of common myths then. Things that might reinforce that hesitation to go around.
Good idea. Myth number 1, go-arounds are for rookies, or going around means I messed up.
Yeah, you hear that sometimes.
Total nonsense. Reality. Go-arounds are a normal, expected part of flying. The best, most experienced pilots go around when necessary. It shows professionalism, discipline, adherence to procedures. There is zero shame, only wisdom in choosing the safe path. Myth number 2, I'm skilled enough, I can usually salvage an unstable approach if I really work it.
The ace pilot syndrome.
Kind of. Reality. It's a high-risk gamble every single time. You might get away with it 9 times, but the 10th time, physics or a sudden gust or just running out of runway catches up to you. Accident reports are filled with pilots who thought they could save it. Why take the chance? The runway isn't going anywhere. Go around, take 5 minutes, come back stable. It's always the smarter play. And myth number 3, stabilized approaches aren't quite as critical in good visual conditions. I can see the runway, I can fix it visually.
That seems logical on the surface.
But it's dangerous. Reality. Visual illusions are powerful. Complacency can creep in on a nice day. Without instrument guidance, it's actually easier to misjudge your path or speed. Many accidents have happened in perfect weather because of unstable visual approaches. The criteria apply just as rigorously on a clear day as in fog. Discipline doesn't take a day off because the sun is shining.
Really important points.
Yeah.
And what about globally? Is everyone on the same page with what stable means?
Yes, largely. That's one of the real success stories in global aviation safety. There's been a remarkable convergence towards common standards for stabilized approaches.
So pretty much the same rules everywhere.
Pretty much identical parameters, yeah. Stable by 1,000 feet AGL on speed, on profile, configured, or you go around. While maybe the culture around reporting or enforcing it might vary slightly place to place.
Like you mentioned, non-punitive cultures being effective.
Exactly. But the core philosophy is the same worldwide now. Stabilized approach or no landing, period. It's universally accepted as critical.
Looking forward then, are there new technologies, new training methods coming online to help pilots nail these stable approaches more consistently and maybe make that go-around decision less fraught?
Definitely. Technology is playing a bigger role. We're seeing more sophisticated alerting systems built into aircraft avionics.
Like what?
Systems like Honeywell's Smart Landing or Enhanced Ground Proximity Warning Systems, EGPWS, they actively monitor parameters like speed, descent rate, flap settings on final approach, and they'll actually call out warnings like unstable or long landing if things aren't right.
A digital co-pilot watching the parameters.
Sort of, yeah. An objective automated reminder. And predictive analytics, AI, that's coming too. Using flight data, AI can identify precursors to unstable approaches, maybe thrust settings or late configuration changes peculiar to certain airports or conditions. The idea is to eventually get real-time advisories in the cockpit, warning before you become unstable.
Proactive warnings.
That's the goal. Plus, flight data monitoring programs already use historical data to brief crews on common unstable approach traps at specific airports, tailoring the awareness. And training is evolving too. There's a huge push to remove the stigma and the surprise element from go-arounds.
How are they doing that?
More realistic scenario-based training in the simulators. Throwing unexpected curveballs at crews' sudden wind shear at 500 feet. A blocked runway spotted late, requiring a go-around from low altitude or an unusual configuration. Practicing the decision-making and the maneuver under pressure.
Building that muscle memory for the tough ones.
Exactly. And evidence-based training, EDT, uses all that real-world flight data to design these challenging, relevant scenarios. Plus, industry groups are working on guidance, like the Go-Around Decision-Making and Execution Project, explicitly framing the go-around as a normal, standard operational decision, completely separate from any notion of pilot hour. So ultimately, yes, the future holds better tools, smarter training, but the fundamentals, they won't change. A stabilized approach remains a cornerstone of safe flying. It's where technology meets timeless airmanship. You know, when you think about it, the discipline needed for a stabilized approach, it goes beyond just flying. It's about meticulous planning, managing complex dynamic variables, actively fighting your own human biases, and having the courage to make a tough call when things aren't perfect. So let me ask you, and everyone listening, what stands out to you as the most challenging or maybe the most surprising aspect of ensuring that safe landing every single time?
That's a truly powerful question, and one I think many of us in aviation and beyond will be mulling over. It perfectly encapsulates the human element at the core of even the most technical operations. That brings us to the end of today's episode of the Captain Podcast. We appreciate you listening, and as always, it's been a pleasure having you with us. A special thank you to our guest for sharing their expertise. Don't forget to like and subscribe to show your support, and feel free to drop a comment with any ideas or topics you'd like us to cover in the future. As always, fly safe, stay sharp, and we'll catch you on the next episode.